Djibouti, a tiny nation in the Horn of Africa. Population, 1 million. Strategic location, controls access to the Red Sea. Through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, 12% of global trade passes. Oil from the Persian Gulf. Goods from Asia to Europe. Whoever controls Djibouti controls a choke point of the world economy. And in 2017, China built a military base there. China's first overseas military base in history. This is the story of how China transformed from a regional power to a global naval force, one port at a time. For centuries, China avoided overseas military presence. No foreign bases, no global deployments. Then, in 2013, Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a $1 trillion plan to build infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Ports, roads, railways, pipelines. Officially, it's about economic development. In reality, it's about strategic access. Every port China builds becomes a potential naval base. Djibouti was the first, but it's not the last. The Djibouti base, officially called a logistics facility, 10,000 personnel capacity, pier for warships, helicopter pads, barracks, storage facilities. Located just miles from the U.S. military base Camp Lemonnier. The irony? America's largest base in Africa shares a city with China's first foreign base. China pays Djibouti $20 million annually for access. For context, the U.S. pays $63 million. China got the same access for less money. Djibouti wins, plays both powers against each other, collects rent from both. Why Djibouti matters. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, 18 miles wide. Yemen on one side, Djibouti on the other. Every ship traveling between Europe and Asia via the Suez Canal must pass through. Oil tankers, container ships, naval vessels. 6.2 million barrels of oil per day. Transit this choke point. If the strait closes, global shipping reroutes around Africa. Costs skyrocket. Supply chains collapse. China imports 80% of its oil through this strait. Protecting this route is a national security imperative. Hence the base in Djibouti. Chinese warships stationed there can protect shipping, escort tankers, respond to threats. China no longer depends on the U.S. Navy to keep the sea lanes open. This is strategic independence. Anti-piracy operations, the initial justification. From 2008 onward, Somali pirates terrorized shipping off the Horn of Africa. The international community responded. NATO, EU, China, all sent warships. China deployed destroyers and frigates to the Gulf of Aden. Anti-piracy patrols became permanent. But warships need logistics, fuel, repairs, resupply. Operating 5,000 miles from China is expensive without a forward base. So China built one. Anti-piracy was the excuse. Strategic access was the goal. Now Chinese warships operate permanently in the region, not just for piracy, for anything China wants. The expansion continues. Djibouti is just the beginning. China is building or financing ports across the Indian Ocean and beyond. Gwadar, Pakistan, a deep-water port, Chinese-built, operated by a Chinese company. Officially commercial, but the port can accommodate warships. Pakistan and China have close military ties. In a conflict, Gwadar becomes a Chinese naval base. Hambantota, Sri Lanka, another Chinese-built port. Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loans. China took a 99-year lease on the port. Now China controls a strategic location near India. Indian Navy watches nervously. Kyaukphyu, Myanmar, Chinese-financed port, gives China access to the Bay of Bengal. Bypasses the Malacca Strait, reduces Chinese dependence on that choke point. Piraeus, Greece. China bought the port, operates the container terminals. NATO member, European Union, but the port is Chinese-controlled. Chinese warships dock there, refuel, resupply. China has a foothold in the Mediterranean. This is the string of pearls strategy, a network of ports encircling the Indian Ocean. Each one provides access, logistics, political influence, and in a conflict, potential naval bases. India is surrounded. The debt trap narrative. Critics call this debt trap diplomacy. China lends money to poor nations for infrastructure projects. The projects are expensive, often unnecessary. The nations can't repay. China seizes the assets, takes control of ports and infrastructure. Example, Hambantota, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka borrowed $1.5 billion from China to build the port. The port generated minimal revenue, Sri Lanka defaulted. China took a 99-year lease on the port and 15,000 acres of surrounding land. China denies this is intentional, claims it's just business. Maybe, but the result is the same. China gains strategic assets. Debtor nations lose sovereignty, and China's naval reach expands. The strategic implications for the U.S. For 75 years, the U.S. Navy dominated global sea lanes. No rival had the bases to challenge American presence. China is changing that. Every Chinese port is a potential challenge to U.S. naval access. Djibouti, Gwadar, Hambantota, Piraeus. Chinese warships can now operate globally, refuel at Chinese-controlled ports, sustain long deployments. The U.S. still has more bases, more allies, more ships. But the gap is closing. In 20 years, China might have 20 overseas bases. Then the Indian Ocean is no longer an American lake. It's contested water. The Indian Ocean, center of gravity. More than 80% of global oil trade passes through the Indian Ocean. Trade routes connect the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Whoever controls the Indian Ocean controls global commerce. China understands this. Belt and road ports give China leverage. In peacetime, it's economic influence. In wartime, it's naval power. China can disrupt shipping, escort its own vessels, deny access to rivals. India sees the threat. India is surrounded by Chinese-controlled ports. Gwadar to the west, Hambantota to the south, Chokepoint to the east. If China and India go to war, Indian Navy faces enemies on three sides. India is building its own navy. More ships, more bases. But China is building faster. The balance tips toward China, the Middle East connection. China is the largest importer of Middle Eastern oil. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, UAE. China needs stability in the Gulf, and it needs military access to protect its interests. China is building relationships with Gulf states. Arms sales, infrastructure projects, economic partnerships, and quietly, discussions about naval access. Reports suggest China is negotiating port access in Iran. If true, China could station warships in the Persian Gulf. That's a nightmare for the U.S. Fifth Fleet. American dominance in the Gulf is unchallenged now. Chinese presence would change the equation. China doesn't need to challenge the U.S. directly. Just having ships in the region alters the balance. Africa, the next frontier. China is investing heavily in African infrastructure. Ports, railways, roads. It's economic development, but also strategic positioning. African nations welcome Chinese investment. No political conditions, no human rights lectures. Just money and infrastructure. Western nations lecture, China builds. Guess who Africans prefer? China gains influence and access. Port of Darala, Djibouti, Chinese operated. Port of Lamu, Kenya, Chinese financed. Port of Bagamoyo, Tanzania, Chinese planned. Port of Walvis Bay, Namibia, Chinese interest. China is building a network along Africa's coast. Every port is a foothold. In 20 years, the African coastline could be lined with Chinese facilities. That's strategic encirclement of the Indian Ocean. The South China Sea connection. China's overseas bases support its South China Sea strategy. China claims the entire South China Sea, builds artificial islands, militarizes them. ASEAN nations protest. The U.S. conducts freedom of navigation operations. But China continues. Why? Because overseas bases provide depth. If the U.S. blockades China, Chinese warships operate from Gwadar, Djibouti, Hambantota. Supply lines remain open. China's economy survives. The overseas bases make China blockade-resistant. This is strategic resilience. China learned from history. Japan lost World War II partly because the U.S. blockaded Japanese shipping. No oil, no resources, economy collapsed. China won't make the same mistake. Overseas bases ensure China can sustain trade even in conflict. Economic and military power combined. China's ports serve dual purposes. Commercial trade during peace. Military logistics during war. This is how China operates. Everything is dual use. Everything has strategic value. A port in Pakistan is commercial until Chinese warships need refueling. A port in Greece is commercial until the Mediterranean becomes contested. China blurs the line between economics and military power. And it works. Nations accept Chinese investment, don't realize they're accepting Chinese military presence. By the time they understand, it's too late. China controls the port. The future, 2030 projection. If current trends continue, China will have 15 to 20 overseas military or dual-use bases, a navy of 400 ships, many capable of global deployment, logistics networks supporting operations in every ocean, energy security through diversified routes. China will be a true global naval power, not just regional, global, rivaling the U.S. Navy in reach and capability. This hasn't happened since the Cold War. The Soviet Navy challenged the U.S. globally. Then the USSR collapsed. American naval dominance went unchallenged for 30 years. That era is ending. China is building the rival navy America hasn't faced in decades. And it's doing it through ports, not battles. Smart, effective, irreversible. The American response. The U.S. is trying to counter China's expansion, strengthening alliances. India, Japan, Australia, AUKUS partnership. Building more ships, though not as fast as China. Establishing access agreements with more nations. But the U.S. is playing catch-up. China started building this network 15 years ago. The U.S. is responding now. That's a 15-year head start for China. Hard to overcome. And many nations prefer Chinese investment over American military presence. The U.S. offers security. China offers money. Money wins in poor countries. China's advantages compound. Final assessment. Djibouti is not just a base. It's a symbol. China is no longer a continental power. China is a maritime power with global reach. The Belt and Road ports are the foundation. Each port extends China's naval range. Together, they form a network rivaling America's. In 10 years, Chinese warships will operate everywhere. Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, Atlantic, Pacific. Sustained by Chinese-controlled ports. Fueled by Chinese-built infrastructure. Protected by Chinese naval power. This is the new reality. China's African base in Djibouti is where it started. But it's far from where it ends. The age of uncontested American naval dominance is over. China built an alternative, one port at a time, and the world is just beginning to realize what that means.